going to start the last chapter. I can't wait to get this done. So without any preparation whatsoever, haven't even seen this chapter in like a year and a half because I never have time to get to it by the end of the semester. So I always just post the PowerPoint and everybody has to read it on their own. So I'm actually going to go over it for the first time in a very, very long time. So let's see what this chapter has to say. All right, let's make that a little smaller so this gets a little bigger. Okay, so this chapter is about therapies. All right, so first thing is some definition, distinguishing one type of therapy from another. So the first kind of umbrella term is just psychotherapy. So psychotherapy is any type of approach that uses psychological rather than biological means to treat psychological orders. So obviously, if you're getting biological treatments, i.e. medications, right, then you are not getting exclusively psychotherapy, right? That is pharmacological, psychopharmacal, however you want to say it, therapy. So that is coming from a medical doctor or a psychiatrist who actually is a medical doctor. So psychotherapy, there are dozens of different kinds. So again, that's just a very blanket term that encompasses anything that doesn't involve medication. All right, insight therapies are approaches to psychotherapy based on the notion that psychological well-being depends on self-understanding. We've all, to some extent, done insight therapy with our friends. You know, your friend's in a relationship, it's not going well, the writing's on the wall, quite obviously to you, but for some reason, they just don't see it, right? They're too close to the situation, there's too much emotion involved in it. So for you, you may walk them through the logic side of things. You may walk them through the pros and cons of certain decisions that they can make, the consequences that might befall them if they stay versus if they left. What alternatives might they have? What coping strategies can you provide for them when they get into these situations that seem to come up over and over again? Intuitively, I think we all know a lot of this stuff. Therapists are really no different, except they have more training. So they just have slightly more tools in their toolbox for all of those things. Psychodynamic therapies are psychotherapies that attempt to uncover repressed childhood experiences that are thought to explain a patient's current difficulties. So psychodynamic therapies are basically from Freud, right? So Freud came up with the notion of repressing our childhood experiences, but then they carry consequences all throughout our life, well into adulthood. So it's the idea of sort of casting a very long, wide net back to our childhood and seeing what we can pull up, right? That is psychodynamic therapies. All right, psychoanalysis is more specifically the term that was the first psychodynamic therapy. There it is, developed by Freud, that uses free association, dream analysis, and transference. We'll talk about each of those things. So free association is a psychoanalytic technique used to explore the unconscious by having patients reveal whatever thoughts, feelings, or images come to mind. So free association is, who did I hear do this the other day? There's a comedian named Brian Regan, very, very funny guy, very clean comic, which is respectable. And he does this bit where he's putting himself back in as if he was 7 or 8 or whatever in school doing spelling and grammar lessons and being called on in front of the class. And he doesn't know the answer, so he just starts blurting out things. And he says, I can't remember the bit now, but he says one thing, and then he says something that rhymes with that thing, and then he says a word that sounds similar to that rhymed word, and then there's some association between that word and something else that he comes up with that neither rhymes nor sounds like that word, but is, like dog and cat kind of thing. They kind of go together in a way, and he just blurts out word after word after word. That is basically free association. So it's whatever word is drummed up from your unconscious that, if I tell you, okay, I'm going to tell you a word, and then I want you to tell me the first word that comes to mind, and I say blue. Some people might say sad. Some people might say ocean, right? Some people might say eyes. So these all are sort of different windows into the thought process, right? If I say blue and you say sad, well, obviously being sad is prevalent on your mind, right? It might be just under the surface of consciousness, but it's there, right? If I say blue and you say eyes, then you're maybe like right here, right now. You're not thinking very deep. It's just very superficial. Like you're looking at me. I have blue eyes. You make that statement. If you say ocean, right? That's a much more positive thing, right? Most people associate the beach and ocean, sunshine and outdoors and everything with all positive energy. So that free association might tell me, the therapist, kind of what direction to go and what's just under the surface for you. So it's kind of a neat technique to use. Sometimes it's right on the money, sometimes it's out of left field. So, I'm not going to say that it works 100% of the time, but it is a very useful technique in my opinion. The second notion here, transference, very important in the field of therapy, right? Any kind of therapy. So with transference, what happens is you have a transference and then you have a countertransference. So a transference is an emotional reaction that occurs during psychoanalysis in which the patient displays feelings and attitudes towards the analyst that were present in another significant relationship. So it's quite simply, and we've, again, probably much of the time experienced this, you're talking to somebody who's just had, a fight with their significant other, and they are relaying what happened, and as they tell you, they're getting angry. And now they're not just telling you, they're kind of yelling at you, right? And I don't understand why guys always have to be like that, and why are guys... That's transference. They have all that pent-up emotion, all those feelings, right? Those negative psychic energy built up from this interaction over here that they've sort of had to bottle up, right? Because they couldn't adequately come to a resolution with their significant other, right? So they kind of had to just cut ties with the conversation at the moment in any way and bottle what they have up, and it just doesn't have anywhere to go. So then they come to you, and then they transfer it all to you. The theory being, just like, we've all been angry and had to walk away from a situation for a little while. So we walk away from a situation, we calm down a little bit, and then we come back. That's sort of the purpose of transference, right? You're going to walk away, you're going to transfer all that negative energy onto me. I am trained to have thick skin, not take it personally, and so you can call me whatever, you can beat me up, you can tell me how bad men suck, I'll probably agree with you. How awful boyfriends are, and blah, blah, blah. And, I'm not going to encourage it, but I'm also not going to refute it. So I'm going to allow that. And to some level, there will be countertransference, right? I will hopefully bring you down a little bit. So I think there's a slide for that. Yeah. So very simply, patient is here. They're transferring all of this negative energy to the therapist, who sort of holds on to it, filters it, and then counter-transference back, the feelings that should be in that situation. So anyways, the notion of transference, pretty important. I probably shouldn't tell the story, but the lady that I did, I'll tell it because I haven't said her name, but the lady that I did my psychotherapy with, we had a very professional relationship. Everything was on the level, 100%. There was no flirtation. Again, very professional by both of us. We were both married at the time. And I would say even happily married. I think at that particular time, things are going pretty well for me, and things were very good for her. But she had a husband that was in a completely different field. I didn't know anything about her work. I don't know what he did. She didn't talk about him all that much, but it was some business type thing. She couldn't have very deep conversations about the issues, the psychological issues that we were getting from clients. All of her training, was sort of above his head. And then I was, I guess, somewhat in the same boat. My ex-wife was a elementary school teacher. So when we would be at work, it was a teacher-mentor situation, right? So we have a responsibility. She had a responsibility to me as my mentor. Every client that left, we would dissect everything that just happened, everything the client said, everything that she said in response, the direction she was trying to make the therapy go, the goals, quizzing me, what would you have said, If I didn't talk, or if I did talk, she would say, why did you say that? What theory is behind that? So we had these back and forth, and she had never had that before, and she really enjoyed it. And I did too, because I thought that's how it's supposed to work, right? So at the end of the semester, I'm asked not to return, through an email, by the way, that she did not respond to, and she wouldn't answer the phone. And turns out she called my dean and told the dean at my college that I had done nothing wrong. I got very, very high marks for my competence and my professionalism, but she had started to develop feelings. And she didn't think that it was fair to either of us being married, even though nothing had happened and neither of us had stepped out of line and we have very professional boundaries, that she didn't like the fact that she would lie in bed at night and look forward to going to work the next day. And was afraid that eventually that would happen to me. So that was kind of an odd situation of transference, right? She was sort of transferring some of her feelings onto me that were not being counter-transferred back to her. But that was I was dumbfounded. I couldn't believe that two psychologists couldn't sit down and talk that issue out. I shouldn't have gotten fired for that. I just think that that was fair for me. Lost a whole semester's worth of hours because of it. And the dean, who's himself a licensed psychologist, was explaining this notion to me. And so I'll never forget that lesson of transference, and how she had projected her feelings onto me that even though they weren't reciprocated, she felt that it wasn't ethical and fair to continue. So it sucked. So it is not entirely uncommon for therapists to start to sort of, we get into this field because we want to help people, right? Obviously there's some part of you that, if you're willing to go through all the schooling and the licensing and everything that's involved to sit there and listen to people and help people with problems, you definitely have a heart for that. And who doesn't like to take somebody under their wing and help them out? Who doesn't sort of fall for the broken person that they think, oh, I can fix that, right? So it's very, very easy for the therapist to develop feelings, and it's even easier for the patient to develop feelings for a therapist, because this person is in a position of knowledge. There's sort of an intimate relationship, not sexually intimate, but intimate emotionally, because you're pouring your soul out to this person. First, second, third visit, if you feel comfortable, you're telling them about everything. Your sexual desires, what's unfulfilled, your deepest, darkest secrets. And so when you have that kind of a bond, sometimes it gets confused for love. And so patients will sometimes sort of test those boundaries, and sometimes therapists, unfortunately, will test those boundaries. There's very, very strict rules ethically about, not dating patients. You can't have been a patient for like 2 years or something. They have to have been discharged more than, and even then, it's very much frowned upon to date a former patient. The burden of proof would lie on you to prove that they hadn't been in touch for over 2 years. So, anyways, this notion is a very important, very big, focused on being in graduate school, basically. All right. Interpersonal therapy. One of the drawbacks from psychodynamic therapy is simply the length of time. It takes forever. Don't forget, we're digging up unconscious experiences from patients that aren't even aware they exist. So it's kind of like looking for, somebody lost their keys in the beach, on the beach, but they don't really remember where they were, and you're walking around, with your metal detector, and you don't even have any idea where to start, right? Will you find those keys? Probably not on the first day, or the second, or the third, or the fifth month, but eventually you might just get lucky and stumble across them, right? So that's kind of the metaphor that I have in my mind, right? There is something somewhere in this vast ocean of long-term memories that has not been retrieved, so it's buried very, very deeply. The patient can't really direct you to what direction to go looking for, because it's repressed and they don't know. And it's up to you to sort of poke and prod in the right places, right? Using, deductive reasoning and logic to kind of figure out where you think you should start looking. That's kind of how it goes in my mind. Interpersonal therapy is a much more brief version. So psychoanalysis, right? That psychodynamic type of therapy, it doesn't have a length. You meet indefinitely, right? Until you stumble upon those keys lost on the beach, right? Which can take years and years and years to even find that. Once you find it, you have to work through it. So it's just an incomprehensible length of time, right? Literally almost for life. Um, Interpersonal therapy was sort of a brief psychotherapy, 12 to 16 weeks, that's designed to help people with depression better understand and cope with problems. So it's more specifically designed around um, things like this, like severe responses to death, right? You lose a loved one, you just can't get over it, right? Weeks pass, months pass. There's obviously a normal grieving period, but you have gone well past that. You go to therapy. They're not going to go all the way back to your childhood and find out that you were traumatized by your first pet parakeet that died when you were 3, right? We're not looking for that, all right? Not in this IPT. We're going to focus sort of on this particular issue, right? And we're going to try to do a little grief counseling. Interpersonal role disputes explores other people's points of view. So sometimes your issue, maybe it's a issue with a family member or a spouse, or maybe it's even a coworker. You just go to work every day and you work with the same person. You just don't get along, right? I had a partner like that once. I got stuck with a partner briefly. It might be why I never liked having a partner. We just did not like each other. He was from the projects. I was from suburbia. I mean, we couldn't have been any more different. We argued over what kind of music to listen to. We argued about what kind of calls to take, because I was wanting to take every call and he wanted to ride every call and do nothing because he was lazy. I wanted to go hands-on in situations that required it, and he wanted to call back up and let them do it because he was afraid of getting in trouble or possibly injured or not doing the right thing. So we hated each other. And God, going to work for several months was just miserable. Fortunately, I finagled my way out of that situation and found a new home that I could go to, so I got out of patrol. But there are people that get stuck with partners for significant lengths of time, and I think if I hadn't had an out, I probably would have wanted to go and maybe talk to somebody about how I can maybe deal with our interpersonal role disputes. That probably would have been beneficial for me. Difficulty in adjusting to role transitions. So there you go, divorce, career changes, retirements, these big roles transitions that occur. I'm seeing this in my father, actually, just retired recently, and after 35 years with the same company. And for some reason, he still gets up at 5:30 in the morning, but now he's got no job to go to, so he gets up and goes outside, and he's unfortunately a pathetically bad chain smoker, so he'll go outside and smoke a few cigarettes, and then he comes in and starts watching TV at 5:45 in the morning, and my mom will wake up. She's been retired for a couple of years now, and she's like, "What are you doing up watching TV? Go back to bed." And then he spends half the day sleeping. So it's like, you get plenty of sleep. You get like 15, 16, 20 hours of sleep a day. I don't really think you need to get up at 5:30 in the morning. But he can't adjust to being retired. Like, he's having a really, really hard time with what does he do with his day, right? So he looks for things to do. He has no hobbies. He has no friends. So, I think some brief psychotherapy about kind of how to manage your time and, your outlook of life, your perspective, all those sort of things should change. They should shift since you're in a new role. Deficits in interpersonal skills. Role playing is one of the tools that's used. Role playing sounds childish and silly, but it is a great way to see the other person's perspective. So, you simply switch roles. So this is great for like marital counseling, right? The husband takes the role of the wife, and the wife takes the role of the husband, and then the counselor, right, the therapist, will sort of direct the conversation, and he'll give you a situation, and he'll say, okay, how would you handle this? And then you, acting as the spouse, will say, well, I don't understand why you load the dishwasher with the plates going backwards. And I guess the wife, acting as the husband, go, well, it doesn't matter which direction they go in, they still get clean either way. And then she would say, well, yeah, but then they fall and they run into each other and they get knocked over because they're not sitting properly, then they get chipped. And he's like, really? Has that ever happened? Show me one of the plates that's chipped and I'll put them the right way. And they'll have this like made up fake argument, but it allows the therapist to really get an insight into how the wife thinks the husband thinks, and how does the husband think the wife thinks. Um, if you just ask that as a question, it doesn't translate as well. You don't get as deep of an answer. But when you use it as an example in a role playing exercise, you really get to see how people feel about the other person's perspective. Um, so that's a great tool. It seems a little childish and immature, and it's kind of silly to do, but very very valuable. All right, humanistic therapies. Psychotherapies assume that people have the ability and freedom to lead rational lives and make rational choices. They really focus on the individual. Um, there's something called person-centered therapy where the therapist creates an accepting climate, and that's something alone that's super important to some clients because, you know, my mom, for instance, I keep throwing my family under the bus, but that's okay. They don't watch these videos. Um, my mom does and does and does for my dad, does all the laundry, all the cleaning, all the cooking, your kind of standard that generation, typical role, right? Takes care of the kids and the house and all that kind of stuff. While my dad does none of those things. It's more like, I'm out of tea, right? She comes running with a pitcher, right? That kind of thing. Um, so she doesn't really feel accepted, right? She feels like a slave in her own home. She's done it for 46 years, so she doesn't really know how to break out of that cycle. And then she'll tell me some of the issues, and I'm conscious not to do this a lot, but I sort of admonish some of her decisions, right? I mean, she should probably stand up for herself a little bit more, and she should probably say no from time to time. And then, she's got the whole anxiety thing going on, so she doesn't feel like there's any facet of her life where she's just fully accepted. Uh, you know, Husband kind of treats her like a slave. Kids say, yeah, Mom, you got some wacky thoughts going on. Her friends kind of think the same thing. But then you go to the therapist, and the therapist is accepting of you as you are. That's a huge, big deal, just providing that. And it can be very difficult because some people come in and they've got all kinds of crazy left field thoughts and ideologies. So finding it in your heart to really provide that, I really feel it's a calling. It's not something I'm particularly good at, by the way. So the therapist creates an accepting climate and shows empathy, freeing clients to be themselves and release their natural tendency towards self-actualization. So remember that Maslow's pyramid, right? We're all trying to achieve self-actualization by checking off all the boxes underneath it, all those levels of the pyramid, right? So that we can get to that top level. This is sort of this type of therapy is sort of helping you find check marks along the way, right? So that you are accepting of yourself. You are not burdened with guilt and shame, things like that sort of are obstacles to achieving the next level. I mentioned this before. It favors the word client over patient because patient is kind of more of a medical. I'm well and a doctor, and you're a patient, which means you're sick, and so you're coming for a cure, right? So there's sort of an underlying notion there that you're unwell for some reason. So in this particular model, they use client, and I actually kind of like that. Again, I've said before, I'm not a very PC person, but I think there's a lot of logic to that, and I kind of like it. It's more of a business transaction. Look, I'm highly educated in this particular field. I have a lot of tools that I can pass on to you and potentially help you. So if you're willing to pay for those services, then I'm more than willing to provide them, and it's a mutually beneficial relationship for us. Let's move forward. I am the therapist, and you are the client. I think that's a much better way to look at it. It is definitely more humane, I think. So I kind of do like that. Something called non-directive therapy is any therapy in which the therapist allows the direction of the therapy sessions to be controlled by the client. Um, I don't care for this because you end up with a bunch of random sessions. You end up with sessions that are about nothing. Um, it's okay to do this for the first few, right? Because you're building a rapport, and that's important. So I get that. But after the first few, right, rapport is either established or it's not. And in my practice, if we don't develop a good rapport after a couple of sessions, then I'm likely to offer at least to transfer you out. Look, we've had several meetings. We really haven't gotten to any. I've asked questions, you dodge them all. You always want to change the subject and talk about the weather or, you know, what you saw last night on TV, and you're sort of, are you here for help? If you're here for help, let's get to some issues, right? I get it, that's difficult, but let's just jump in with both feet. And if you're not willing to do that and you just need an outlet to talk about the weather, then I could refer you out to some other people that might be cheaper and more willing to do that, right? I'm in this profession because I want to help people, and if I'm not helping you, then I need to pass you along to somebody else because you're taking up a spot that somebody else could be in that could be getting help, which may sound a little harsh, but sometimes that opens people up. Sometimes people take you up on it. They're like, oh, well, okay, I'm out, and they leave, and you can't please all of the people all the time. So, bye. So, I'm just not a particularly big fan of this non-directive therapy. I mean, the whole point of being a therapist is you should be able to steer the ship, right? So they're kind of lost in this sea of maladaptive thinking, overcome with emotion, and your job is to sort of steer them through those waters, help them steer through those waters, not just be a passenger in the boat and just go along for the ride wherever they choose to take you. I don't see that as beneficial. Gestalt therapy, why is there a slide for this? Gestalt therapy is a therapy that emphasizes the importance of clients fully experiencing in the present moment their feelings, thoughts, and actions, and then taking responsibility for them. That sounds great. I don't know a whole lot about this, to be quite honest. It's not used anymore. If you do a search for Gestalt therapists, probably won't find very many. Literally in a city as big as Houston, you might find 2 or 3 at the most. And they're probably ancient. They're probably 80 years old. It's not, speaking of that, I probably shouldn't admit this either, but recently, I think it's been 4 weeks now, 4 sessions, I have decided to go to couples counseling. Never done that before. Never in my life done couples counseling. And it's kind of hilarious. The dude has 4 PhDs. One's in child psychology. One is a different kind of PhD, which we'll talk about in a little bit, I think, in just kind of general or adult psychology. One is in theology, and one is in quantum physics. So he's kind of my hero educationally. He was almost too old to be drafted into Vietnam. He's like 80 years old, and he falls asleep in every single session. It's hilarious. So we'll be talking, and he will sit there, and his eye, I don't know if you can see my eyes, but he sits there, and he's like, yeah, and I'm like, micro sleep, I know what that is, I teach about that. So, yeah, he might know what Gestalt therapy is, but other than, his generation, this is kind of gone by the wayside. All right, speaking of relationship therapies, relationship therapy is an attempt to improve clients' interpersonal relationships or create new relationships to support clients' efforts to address psychological problems. So a couple different kinds. There is family therapy. I think family therapy would be super beneficial for me in this situation because my girlfriend has a 15-year-old daughter that I absolutely do not get along with. She was 12 when I came into the picture, and very emotionally stunted, very dysfunctional in a lot of ways. And I was making great progress, and then, we hit one obstacle, and it's like we're literally back to square one. 3 years of work completely out the window. And I just cannot, I don't have the patience for that. I'm like, well, I'm done. So, we live in the same house, we tiptoe around each other, we don't look at each other, we don't occupy the same room at the same time. It's a stupid way to live for both of us, but I'm absolutely done. So, that's probably why we started the couples therapy, so we could get a few things on track there, so that mom and I are on the same page of how to address this, and then we will convert that over to family therapy. So that happens a lot, right? For mixed families, when stepchildren are involved, I will tell you that is the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. Being a parent is, I think, relatively easy. Hopefully it comes naturally to most people. So I don't consider it work. I would never say like, oh, I have to babysit my kid. You don't babysit your own kid. It's, I have my child. It's not, I have to babysit my kid. I was talking to my mom today, and she said that she got really, really mad at my dad whenever I was a baby. Whenever she was at work on a Saturday, and he was home with me, and she went to her like 5-hour shift. She worked at a grocery store back then. and she came back home, and the neighbor that was a very elderly, like in her late 60s, I guess that's very elderly. That's not very elderly, but elderly lady that lived across the street was watching me, and my dad was nowhere to be found. This is before cell phones and all that. And I had gotten tonsillitis, and so I was sick and I had thrown up, and he didn't want to clean it up, so he went across the street and asked the neighbor, hey, I think my son's sick. Can you tell me what to do? And she came over and offered to watch me, and he was like, okay, cool, I'm out, and he went out and hung out with his friends. It's weird because I don't picture that. I can't wrap my head around my dad being like that. But apparently, there's a lot of things from whenever I was too young to remember that sort of lay the groundwork for him not really having the tools for fatherhood. Still wanting to go out and party and hang out with the boys and things like that. So not everybody has that instinct. I remember coming home from 16-hour shifts, police work, and if my kids are still up, whenever I happen to come home at whatever hour I came home, I'm barely out. I didn't even take my uniform off. I maybe took my gun belt off, put it on the table, and then laid down on the floor and played Legos for hours. Back killing me, tired, hungry, wanting a shower, wanting to change, hot, sweaty. But it didn't matter. I only had a couple of hours of, before my kids' bedtime, and I wanted to soak up every minute of that. So, it's unfortunate. I think some people instinctually have that, and other people just don't. And, sometimes family therapy can kind of point that out. I'm sure if somebody would have pointed out to my dad that, he was being irresponsible and emotionally unavailable, that there are consequences to that he might have tried a little harder, but there was no family therapy back then that was common, so he didn't know. So family therapy, couples therapy, and then group therapy. Group therapy is great for support groups. We've all seen movies and TV shows or whatever. Alcoholics Anonymous. They also have Narcotics Anonymous. They have a group help for just about everything, right? For widowers and widows and people with terminal illnesses, people with PTSD. You name people, victims of domestic abuse, victims of sexual assault. There's just literally any trauma that you can imagine. There's probably a support group for it. I have run a couple of them, and depending on how well it's moderated and the group. Sometimes you get a really good dynamic going, and people are really prone to sharing, and it's very beneficial just to be able to have a safe environment where you can talk about your issue and everybody gets it. Everybody in the group is experiencing that problem because you can only tax your friends for so long about your issues, right? Maybe you have a messy divorce and you're brokenhearted about things, and you tell your friends and they're there for you, and that's a shoulder to cry on. But God, at some point they're like, okay, you need to move on now, right? And if you're not careful, you can run those friends off because you become known as, that needy friend that's always got a problem, right? So, you can go to groups and not wear them out because everybody knows what you're going through. And so, I'm a big fan of support groups. I think they're very, very beneficial for those that choose to utilize them. All right, behavior therapy. This goes back to behaviorism, right? The John Watson and B.F. Skinner perspective. Treatment approach that is based on the idea that abnormal behavior is learned and that applies the principles of operant conditioning, classical conditioning, and or observational learning. Remember, those are kind of the three big trifecta of by behavioral perspective, to eliminate inappropriate or maladaptive behaviors and replace them with more adaptive responses. So one of the groups that I did was an anger management group. And, there are certain ways that people react physically whenever threatened or angry. They ball their fist up, they furrow their brow, they have that mean, I'm going to kick your butt look, they have that kind of stuff, literally standing up, puffing their chest out. All of these are behaviors, obviously. And that was one of the things that we talked about is when somebody makes you mad, if you do that, right, you're going to cause them to be more defensive. And so they're going to stand up and do those same things. And now you're going to interpret that as they're being aggressive, but they're only being aggressive in response to your aggression. So you have to be very mindful of your body language. You're getting upset. You need to close your eyes. You need to take some deep breaths. You need to count to 3. You need to put yourself mentally on a beach somewhere long enough to regain composure and not ball your fist and stand up and throw something down and do all these things. So that was a little bit of behavior therapy. We're focusing on specific behaviors that precipitate physical altercations. Okay, and it's depending on the individual. Sometimes it's useful. Sometimes it proves to be more difficult to implement in reality than it does in theory. Behavior is modified through the reward system for good behavior, or the elimination of undesirable behaviors through timeouts or removal of privileges. So, if you're an adult and you're trying to do some kind of behavior therapy, you are the one that has to modify that, or maybe a spouse. So, every time you go, let's say, a day without smoking, right? Then the wife says, I don't know, whatever, right? Whatever you want. I'll rub your feet for an hour or 30 minutes or something, right? And you're thinking, do I want a foot rub for 30 minutes or do I want one cigarette? And you're like, yeah, okay, I'll put the cigarette away, and that would be like the reward for the good behavior, right? But every time you actually go through and smoke a cigarette, right, then you have to mop the kitchen, or some 30-minute long chore that will be chosen by the wife. You are not responsible for, and you have to agree to do this, and you have to make good on your promise, right? And if you do, it can be a fairly decent. Doesn't work well for smoking, by the way. Nicotine is just too addictive. So this is not particularly good for this example, but just as an example, maybe road rage, right? Anytime you get cut off by a driver or somebody's driving slow or whatever, and you have the feeling that you want to yell at them or cuss at them or cut them off or flip them off or whatever, right? But you fight that urge and you pass it, then you get some reward. And every time you succumb to it and you do it, then you have to pay some penalty. Something like that would be probably better for behavior therapy than smoking cessation. All right. Systematic desensitization is a behavior therapy that is based, again, on classical conditioning, but it's more for fears, and it's somebody that is afraid of whatever they're afraid of, right? And you train them in deep muscle relaxation, and then you start to gradually sort of, whatever that anxiety-producing situation is, whether it's a real situation, like I've mentioned before with the lady that had the sisters that were horrible to her, that was a real situation, it wasn't imagined, and it produced anxiety. So we would have her imagine sitting at the table with her sisters that were making fun of how she dressed and what she looked like and how heavy she was and all these things. And we would see the anxiety build in her right there in front of us in the room, as if she really was in front of her sisters. You do it just a little bit, and then you back it back off, and then you do it a little bit more, and you back it back off. So you're systematically desensitizing them to that situation. So hence the name, right? Pretty self-explanatory. You bring it in just a little bit at a time, until they're able to confront it. So in the situation with the girl that was had a pickle phobia, right? They took her to that pickle farm. That was an attempt for systematic desensitization. They had it on a platter. They were really far away. They tried to get a little bit closer and a little bit closer and a little bit closer. And hopefully every step they took would produce anxiety, but then it would go back down. And then they take another step and it would produce anxiety and it would go back down. I actually had to take my son when he was maybe 4 to a food therapist. That's a real thing. Again, falls under the purview of occupational therapy, but we had to do systematic desensitization for certain kinds of foods because he was super picky. He wouldn't eat but about 3 things. And so first it was, whenever I make this dinner, like macaroni and cheese. I was dying for him to eat macaroni and cheese. Every kid in the world likes mac and cheese, right? And I knew if he just tried it, he would like it. But he thought it looked slimy, and the texture, I think, is what bothered. The sound that it makes when you stir it, which is a pretty horrible sound, to be honest. So first it was, I'm going to take a spoon, and I'm going to hold it in front of you, and I want you to smell of it, and then I'm going to put the spoon away, and that's it, and then you can eat whatever you want. And that was a little bit of a fight, but he would smell it, and that was it. Then, and that worked up to where he would smell it with no issue, right? Then it was, I'm going to put it on your plate. You don't have to eat it. I'm telling you now, you don't have to eat it, but it's going to reside on your plate for the entirety of your meal. So he'd very carefully pick around it or whatever, and then that would go on for every meal until he was used to it being there. And then it was, you have to pick it up on a separate fork, and you have to touch your tongue to it. You don't have to eat it, just touch your tongue to it. You can take a drink right away, you can take another bite, but that you don't have to eat it. So we did that. That is and then eventually, you have to put it in your mouth, and then you don't have to swallow it, and you can spit it right back out. And then you have to put it in your mouth, hold it for 30 seconds, and then you can either swallow it or spit it out. And then we started combining other forms of behavior therapy. Once it's in your mouth, if you just go ahead and swallow it, then we'll give you a reward, right? If you spit it out, no reward. No punishment, but no reward. And so eventually, well, this isn't that bad. Next thing you know, he's eating macaroni and cheese for full meals. So it took a lot of patience, a lot of time, but that is a systematic desensitization with a little bit of classical conditioning added on top of that. All right, flooding is a behavior therapy based on, again, classical conditioning to treat phobias where you expose them to an object for an extended period of time. It's a little different than systematic desensitization because, think of the two words. Systematic desensitization is a little baby steps. Flooding is just what it sounds like. Boom, flooding, right? So I just finished The Haunting of Bly Manor on Netflix, and there's a scene where she gets locked. I'm not giving away any spoilers, I promise. There's a scene where she gets locked in a closet and she starts freaking out like a claustrophobic person would freak out, right? Just absolutely losing her mind, banging on the door, like you can see the terror, overcoming her, and she's just banging and banging and banging, and then the camera kind of fades back. And I was thinking to myself, how terrifying a situation like that must be whenever you're, afraid of closed spaces like that. And there's some other things to be afraid of in that situation. Again, I won't give it away. But then I was thinking to myself, when the camera comes back up, I bet she's balled up in a corner, probably completely asleep. And that's pretty much exactly what happened. So I impressed myself because, we go back to that general adaptation syndrome, right? Where the alarm and then the resistance and then that third phase is exhaustion. So I was like, man, as much as she's throwing this huge fit, right? Nobody can do that forever. She's going to wear herself out and she's going to just be asleep in the corner. And if you look at the behavior from the first minute that she was locked in to, let's just say it was 30 minutes. I have no idea how long it was, but let's say it was 30 minutes. And you look at that, well, at 8 o'clock, let's just say it's 8 o'clock, she's locked in a closet. At 8:30, she's locked in a closet. So the situation hasn't changed. It's the same closet. It's the same exact everything. But in the first situation, she was losing her mind. She was screaming, yelling, heart rate's up. Physiologically, she has all the bells and whistles, the adrenaline, all of that kind of stuff going on. At 8:30, she's probably back to homeostasis, leveled out on everything. Why? Because of flooding. Because your senses can only take so much for so long, and then your body fights its way back to homeostasis. So that's what happened in that case. So that's the theory behind flooding, is that you just inundate the person with whatever the phobia is, and you really have no choice but to cry it out. It's kind of like when parents let their babies cry it out, instead of running to their aid, which sometimes that's just what you have to do, right? You have to let them cry it out. That's sort of like flooding. All right, exposure and response prevention, behavior therapy that exposes patients with OCD to stimuli that triggers obsession and compulsion rituals, while patients resist performing the compulsion rituals for progressively longer periods of time. So this is just systematic desensitization that's specific to OCD. That's all that is. Aversion therapy is it's when you match a stimulus. It's basically classical conditioning, but it's when you, let's say you're trying to quit smoking, and let's say that you absolutely hate tuna fish, right? So you tell yourself, all right, I'm going to quit smoking, which I can't do, right? I'm addicted, 3 packs a day, my whole life. I can't get rid of it, but I absolutely hate tuna fish. So every time I smoke a cigarette, I'm going to take 1 bite of tuna, chew it up, and swallow it. And so eventually, because you hate tuna so much, you start associating those two things together. You create sort of an association between those two things, and next thing you know, the idea, it's kind of like when you get sick. It's like when I was a kid, I got, whenever I would get sick, I get tonsillitis like every year on schedule. I get strep throat all the time. Um, and every time that I would get sick, my mom would make me drink the lemon lime Gatorade. And so my association with Gatorade, that particular flavor of Gatorade, is throwing up. And so I just couldn't eat it. It's like when you get food poisoning from eating a specific kind of food, and then you just can't ever eat that food again. That's basically aversion therapy. So it's again pairing a stimulus with an undesirable behavior until the behavior becomes associated with pain or discomfort, or just not liking it, and then you tend to avoid it in the future. All right, participant modeling is a behavior therapy in which an appropriate response is in which an appropriate response to a feared stimulus is modeled in graduated steps, and the client attempts to imitate the model encouraged by the therapist. It's pretty self-explanatory. I don't need to go into that. All right, here's the big daddy. This is therapy today. All that other stuff is really kind of historical references because not a lot of people do any of those therapies. I would say 90 to 95% of therapists these days do cognitive behavioral therapy. Therapies that assume maladaptive behavior can result from irrational thoughts, irrational beliefs, and irrational ideas. Rational emotive behavior therapy, let's see, let me read that. All right, it's just another term for the same thing, basically. Okay, so CBT kind of looks like this. What we think certainly affects how we act and how we feel, right? Whatever's in your mind, whatever frame of reference you have, your perspective is influential in what your behaviors end up being and how you feel, right? Well, what we do affects how we think and how we feel, and what we feel affects how we think and what we do. So all three of these things, thought, behavior, and emotion, are intertwined. Every one of them affects the other two of them. So if we want to change a behavior, according to CBT, the best way to change a behavior is to learn to control our thoughts better. The best way to control our thoughts is to reel in our emotions and pay attention to our behaviors. So, kind of like Freud's long list of defensive mechanisms, here's a fairly exhaustive, not completely exhaustive, list of cognitive errors. This is probably, next to those defense mechanisms, this is my second favorite slide in this entire course. All of these things. Because once again, I feel like, even though you're not a trained therapist, if you have a fairly good idea of these things, if you really kind of read up more than just this PowerPoint on these things, when you find yourself at odds with some sort of cognitive dissonance in your relationship, you can go down this checklist on your own and sort of ask yourself, am I doing this? Am I doing this? Am I doing this? And you can do it for somebody else. Now again, be careful, don't diagnose people, don't tell them that you're doing this or whatever. Nobody wants to hear that, but it's a good peace of mind to know that the other party is doing these cognitive errors, right? So going through them, all or nothing thinking, right? That's not usually how life works, right? Maybe you don't get this, but that doesn't mean you can't get any, right? So you say, oh, I didn't get into Harvard, so I better not go to college. Nobody gets into Harvard, right? Like with 1% of applicants, maybe. So I knew a guy that applied for the feds, and he didn't get through their hiring process, and that was it. And I'm like, there's more than one federal agency, right? Like, I went through the hiring process for the Secret Service, the DEA, the FBI, and the CIA. So I've been through 4 hiring processes, and let me tell you, they are dramatically different. CIA, next to impossible. The FBI, very, very difficult. Secret Service, believe it or not, wasn't that difficult. It wasn't, testing wise and everything else, it just wasn't that hard. I think a lot of people would probably be able to qualify for a career there. DEA, if you're physically fit, that's like the biggest thing they're looking for. They'll teach you everything else, but you got to be able to do push-ups and pull-ups and sit-ups and run, all that kind of stuff. So, I'm trying to explain to him, like, okay, well, you didn't get that one agency, but if you just want to go fed, there's, marshals and Homeland Security, there's all kind of ICE. I mean, there's all these different places you can go. So that's an all or nothing thinking. Catastrophizing, a lot of people are guilty of this one. Um, you think the whole world is going to end because something didn't happen, right? You didn't get a particular job that you wanted, and now you're never going to amount to anything. Well, no, you didn't get that job. It's a little bit of all or nothing, but it's also catastrophizing, right? Um, Discounting the positive. Um, there are positive pieces to life, right? So we talked a little bit about this with reframing, right? So maybe you have a job and you don't love your job, right? But at least you have a job, and at least that job gives you benefits and vacation, and it's fairly close to home, so your commute is very easy. Um, I mean, there's a lot of positives involved in, sometimes people forget all of those and they focus on the negative. So you can sort of help them reframe it by not discounting positive. Emotional reasoning, even though we fight all the time and we have nothing in common, I think she loves me. Well, if you fight all the time, then there's a reason for that, right? You know, Relationships need to exist on more than love alone. I mean, it's great to be a romantic and think that that's all you need, but you don't. You need more than just love. You can't just fall in love with somebody you have nothing in common with, right? You disagree on parenting. You disagree on, one's a spender, one's a saver. You disagree on, your sex drive is very, very different. Maybe your looks are very different. One person's a 9 and the other person's like a 4. Well, there's going to be some jealousy issues potentially there. There's going to be some attraction issues there. It's great to say, oh, I love them though. Okay, but if you're fighting all the time, right, you're emotionally reasoning that, we're together because of love, but maybe you shouldn't be, right? Maybe you're together for some other reason. Maybe there's a cognitive error here. Um, so that's emotional reasoning. Labeling, this is basically just stereotyping, which of course is not always right. They say don't judge a book by its cover, right? So, but then literally they write what the book is about on the cover. So that saying, where does that come from? Don't judge a book by its cover. I mean, it literally tells you what the book is about. Anyways, mind reading. Sometimes people just look at somebody and they just make all kinds of assumptions. And it's like, whoa, how do you know what they were thinking? You don't know what they were thinking when they did what they did. I'm pretty guilty of that because I feel like I have a pretty good idea why people think the way that they think. So I have a tendency sometimes to say, oh, I know why she said that. She said that because this is what she was thinking. And they're like, I wasn't thinking that. Yes, you were. On a subconscious level, you were thinking that. So I have to watch that one. Overgeneralization. This is somebody that's like, this goes on tons in today's society. I hate all cops. Man, they're not all bad. Some of them suck, right? Some of them are horrible. Some of them definitely should not wear a badge. Some of them are really nice people. Really caring, willing to put their life on the line for strangers. I mean, how can you hate all of them, Do you know how many people I've pulled over and not given a ticket to? Probably 10 times more than people I actually gave tickets to. I hated writing tickets. Hated it. But I would pull people over just to get good PR for our department. I'd pull people over and I'd say, the reason I stopped you is you didn't quite make that yellow light. You have plenty of time to stop, but instead of, stopping and being patient and waiting your turn, you decided to blast through a red light in an intersection. Thankfully, nobody was coming, nobody was hurt. That was extremely dangerous what you did. You also don't have your seatbelt on. You also don't have your registration. You also have a tail light that's out. Do you realize that you have 4 offenses right now? And technically, I should probably take you to jail because it doesn't make sense to write somebody $1,000 worth of tickets, right? So I should take you to jail and I should impound your car, and then you bail yourself out tomorrow after serving a couple of days to pay off all your tickets, and then a couple of more $100 to get your car out of the pound. But I'm not going to do that. All right? I'm just going to ask you to please keep in mind that you may be in a hurry, but you're putting other people in danger. Can we just agree that maybe next time you'll stop and you have a nice day? And they just look at me wide-eyed like, are you freaking kidding me? And I'm piling it all on. Nobody in their right mind would write all of those things, right? But if I'm going to pull you over, I'm going to make it worth my while. I'm going to tell you all the things that I could write you for, hoping that will make people stop the overgeneral. And this is 10, 15 years ago, and it's way worse now. So I wish that more people did, good PR type stuff like that, right? So that people don't overgeneralize, but it happens. Tunnel vision is what it sounds like, right? It's somebody that gets too focused on one thing. Um, and then personalization, I don't know that one as well, to be honest. She got off the phone quickly. She must not want to talk to me because she hates me. Um, it makes me think of my mom. They had old neighbors. They've moved now, but they had neighbors that lived behind them that they got to be friends with, and they had a pool. So they put a gate, their wooden fence between. We couldn't see through it, but it was a big wooden gate, and you could open it and go from yard to yard. And this woman's name was Gina, and Gina told my mom, "Hey, anytime you want to come swimming, just come on over." So my mom would sit on the back porch a lot, and she would hear Gina splashing around in the pool because she worked from home. And my mom was retired, so they're both home all the time. Husbands are off to work. And my mom would be like, "Well, I guess she's not really my friend." Why? She's over there swimming. She didn't call and invite me to come over. But what? That doesn't mean she's not your friend or she doesn't like you. Maybe she just, I don't know, maybe she wants to go skinny dipping. She doesn't want you there for that. Or maybe she's just going to dive in for 5 minutes. She doesn't have very long to swim. She doesn't want to ask you to go in, get your hair fixed, and get her bathing suit on and come over there and get in the pool. And then she's like, "Well, I got to go back to work. I only had a 15-minute break." I mean, there's all kinds of reasons, right? That is a cognitive error. My mom's very guilty of that. All right. Biomedical therapy. We have kind of mentioned this before, the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist. A psychologist cannot prescribe medicine and does not have a medical degree. A psychiatrist can do those things. They have a medical doctorate, and then they do a residency in the field of psychology. So they end up getting into the field of psychiatry, where they primarily prescribe meds. Can they do therapy? Absolutely. Do they? Not usually. And the ones that do therapy do a little bit of therapy. And the only reason that they do the therapy is because they want to stay practiced, right? Because if you look at what they charge for medical management, and I don't remember what the numbers are now exactly, and this is old information, so it's probably more than that now. But for medical management, they can charge a 15-minute block to the insurance for like $250. That's what they bill your insurance. So they could literally make $1,000 an hour just running patients one. How are all your meds going? You taking your meds? Yep. Any bad side effects? Nope. Everything's good. All right, cool. Haven't gained any weight. Your appetite is good. No sexual dysfunction. So, let's just keep on with the same meds. I'm going to refill your prescription. Come see me again in 6 weeks. They're out the door, right? $250 for that. For psychotherapy, most insurances that I've been in, I haven't really been on this side of this, right? But this is a little bit secondhand information. But what I understand is about $180 an hour is about the most that they would let you charge, and sometimes you don't get all of that. It depends on the insurance. Sometimes it's not more than $90. So put yourself in that situation. I can either make $90 an hour doing therapy, or I can make $1,000 an hour asking if your meds are good. Biomedical therapy is very lucrative. Now, I said earlier that psychologists do not prescribe medicine. That is not particularly accurate. Texas is one of the few states that has changed their laws, and they have allowed psychologists to prescribe certain medications if they have the required training. And I haven't looked at the numbers in probably 10 years, but that law came out probably 15 years ago. And about 5 years after that law came out, I looked it up, and there were 2. In the entire state of Texas, there were 2 psychologists that got all of the, it's a lot, by the way. They got all of the psychopharmacological training. Say that word 3 times fast, right? Play that word on Scrabble, you'll win. But they got all the psychopharm classes and whatever they needed, and they got the licensing, and then you have to carry malpractice insurance for it. I mean, it's a lot. So they got all that stuff to be able to prescribe medicine. I would venture to say there's not more than a few, probably not more than a dozen or so in the whole state of Texas. So is it possible to prescribe as a psychologist? Yes. Is it likely? No. If you're going to go through that much school, just go to med school, right? So it works a little better for you. All right, here's a list of all the professional titles, right, and the different educations and kind of what their services are. So again, a psychiatrist has a medical degree, and there's medical degree and a doctorate of osteopathology. Both of these are considered medical degrees. Just like with clinical psychologists, there's two. There's a PhD, or there's what's called a PsyD, or a doctorate of psychology. Basically, the difference between them is research. So if you do a PhD, you have to do a dissertation, which means you design a research study, you perform the study, you crunch all the numbers, you write everything up, you've written a dissertation, right? Which is essentially a book. My dissertation was like 130 or so pages long. That's pretty short. I've seen dissertations that are 200 pages long, so it's a book. A PsyD does not do the research. Instead of all those hours of dissertation and research, it's clinic hours. So you're putting in time with clients. So PsyDs are great if you're going to go into that field and you're going to be a therapist. You get a little extra training on that. And when you're turned loose to go sit for your exams and everything, you've been doing it for a while. But you will never teach, right? Not usually. Most of the time, higher education wants you to have the PhD because you have that research back. You can teach grad students and things like that. So that's really the only difference between these two degrees. We've mentioned before that clinical and counseling psychologists are essentially exactly the same thing. So it's the same exact degrees, different title, but they do essentially the same thing. School psychologist is a couple different ways you can get that. You can have an education doctorate and sit for the board for school psychology. I looked into switching over to this, and I would need to take about a year's worth of classes that are specific to adolescent assessments that I don't currently have. There's only a couple of schools in the whole country that offer that kind of weird conversion program. So it's not something that I can really do. But again, the school psychologist is working in schools, identifying learning disorders, behavioral disorders in a school setting amongst students. You can get a PhD in that, education, and in some states, a master's degree will suffice, and you can call yourself a school psychologist, not in Texas. A social worker is a master's degree level. They can do diagnosis and counseling, treatment. They are a little more in touch with social support programs. So Alcoholics Anonymous and battered women's shelters, things like that. So they're a little bit more in tune with community resources than your LPC. LPC is the next one, licensed professional counselor. That is also a master's degree. And basically they do what a clinical psychologist does, but because they only have the master's degree, they don't quite have the research backing. So some of the more theoretical approaches like psychodynamic theory and like IQ tests are just basically beyond their education. So they're not able to give all assessments. And again, some of their a master's degree is very respectable, but it's just not deep enough for some of the types of counseling that exists. And then there's a different degree for licensed marriage and family counselor. It's a different license, rather. And then there's a licensed chemical dependency counselor. Educational requirements are different for every state. Apparently, I have everything for that. I would need to sign up and go take the exam, but I have no desire to be that. So someday I might get it, just to put it on my resume, but I don't want to work with people that have chemical dependency issues because I just don't feel like I know enough about that. All right, I think I've kind of talked about most of this. Psychotropics is what we call any drug that affects mental activity, behavior, or perception. So psychotropics are antipsychotics, antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications. These are all fall kind of under the purview of psychotropics. Antipsychotic drugs are what they sound like, right? They combat issues of psychosis, delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, all that stuff we talked about for schizophrenia. They're also called neuroleptics. So, if you get into psychopharmacology, some of these things just have multiple names, right? Psychotropic and neuroleptic. A neuroleptic is a kind of psychotropic, so it can get a little confusing until you really kind of understand what they're talking about. There is something in the old school neuroleptics, the antipsychotics, that is a very common side effect that causes, um, because they're neurologically based, they cause kind of a misfiring over time. Because remember, you build up tolerance, right? So you take psychotropics for life most of the time, so especially neuroleptics. The antipsychotics, you don't get cured from that, right? If you have something like schizophrenia and you have psychotic um, symptoms, then you're going to have that for life. So you're going to be prescribed a neuroleptic, and you're going to build up a tolerance, and that medicine's not going to work anymore. So we're going to up your dose. Now it works again. Now you get tolerant to that, just like anything. So these tolerances build and build and build and build and build. So we have to give you extreme amounts later in life. And one of the negative side effects for some of the older neuroleptics is something called tardive dyskinesia, or TD. They call it the TD shakes. And there was an inmate that used to work for me. His name was Shaky. Everybody called him Shaky. He just I thought it was like Parkinson's or something, whatever. But he was fine with the nickname. I mean, I just called him he introduced himself as Shaky. So I was like, whatever. He was one of the few people who wouldn't let me call him by, his actual last name. And turns out he had been on and I didn't know this until I had to run the pill line one time. And I saw him come in and he got Thorazine. Thorazine is a very popular older version neuroleptic. And the reason that he was taking that, even though it's older, is because he was in prison, and that's what they get. They get the cheap old stuff. And it has really bad side effects. So once you get tardive dyskinesia or TD, it's pretty much for life. So he's going to be shaken like that forever. So yeah, it's pretty bad stuff. Atypical antipsychotics produce fewer side effects, but as you can imagine, they're more expensive. They're newer, so somebody has to pay those pharmacology companies. Antidepressants, what they sound like, they act as mood elevators. The first generations were called tricyclics. They worked by blocking the reuptake of norepinephrine and serotonin. So remember we talked about that synaptic cleft, right? We have those neurotransmitters that go from the axon to the dendrite and cell body of another one. So in that little kind of I can't think of what that liquid is called, cranial brain fluid, anyway, whatever it's called. So this is the medicine that blocks those receptor sites, right? So it can't go right back in. So it comes out and then it's kind of trapped, and then you have no choice but your body to use it. It can't stick its hand out and then run back in and hide before you have a chance to effectively use it. These were very effective, although there's a lot of side effects, including sedation, dizziness, nervousness, fatigue, dry mouth, forgetfulness, and weight gain. Weight gain is no joke. I mean, I've seen people that have been on antidepressants, especially tricyclics, and they are obese. And they don't eat much. They just retain everything they eat, right? It's just one of the side effects of the drug. So, again, it's another reason why people stop taking antidepressants, because they'd rather be depressed than experience all the physical side effects. Second generation are SSRIs. Those are still very popular today. They are FDA approved for depression. They are also approved for OCD, for bulimia, which we didn't talk about. It's an eating disorder, and panic disorder. So it really does quite a few different things. There are slightly less side effects, although they do still exist. And again, like with all medicine, it's individualized. So some people have worse side effects than others. Sexual dysfunction is a potential side effect of the second generation ones. So some people, especially younger people, because don't forget, a lot of these depression symptoms happen in like the mid-20s. Well, mid-20 or early 30-year-old wants to deal with sexual dysfunctions already. SNRIs appear to be even more effective. That's the selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. SSRI is selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So serotonin and norepinephrine, they work on different brain chemicals, but these are a lot more expensive, a little bit newer. There's fewer studies out there, but they do seem to provide fewer side effects. So SNRIs are also very common if you have insurance that's willing to pay for it. Another class of antidepressants are, I mentioned this before, monoamine oxidase inhibitors. These are kind of a last resort. if the other ones don't work, there are a lot of side effects and there's a lot of food interactions. You cannot drink alcohol at all, like never. So a lot of people, again, early 20s, mid 20s, they don't want those kind of restrictions and they don't want the side effects that come with these. But if your depression's bad enough, then it might be worth it. And then finally, we have lithium. This is what's prescribed for bipolar, and that is really dangerous. So, because you can get lithium poisoning very, very easily. So, what they basically do is they have to do blood work every couple of months, no more than 6 months. And they have to test your blood lithium levels to make sure that you're not going to get metal poisoning from it. So, very, very bad. And again, lots of things you have to avoid, lots of side effects. But this one is the only one that really hits that manic phase, right? It hits both the depression and the manic phase. So lithium is bad news, but necessary for some. All right, last is anti-anxiety medications, also called benzodiazepines. It is the most prescribed psychotropic medication, even more so than antidepressants, if you can believe that. They're very dependency producing, so people get on them and they get kind of hooked on them. You've probably heard of Xanax, or what they call it on the streets called bars. Valium, Librium. I've not heard of the Librium, but anyway, it's on there. If you discontinue this, especially if you quit cold turkey, as I mentioned before, is very, very bad. You get very, very bad withdrawal symptoms. They can be physical or psychological withdrawal symptoms. You start acting very oddly, making very weird decisions that you know better than to make, so that can be very bad. The last two things in the chapter are ECT, or electroconvulsive therapy. Apparently this is still utilized today. It's considered a biological therapy in which an electric current is passed through the right hemisphere of the brain. It's usually reserved for patients with depression who are suicidal. This is still from the show Homeland with Claire Danes. So I believe she was bipolar. I don't remember her being suicidal, and they are running it through both sides. I think typically they put this on one side and the other one's kind of on the top of your head. Kind of maybe off to the side a little bit over here, but at any rate, it's a movie, so whatever. But I did have a student in a class one time that said, "Yep, no, they've had this recently, and they were young. They were like 19." So I let them share what they wanted to share. I didn't feel comfortable asking invasive questions in the middle of class in front of everybody, so I just kind of left it alone. Said thanks for sharing, but it was interesting to me that somebody that young would have experienced something this fairly extreme already. So. And then the last one is psychosurgery, brain surgery performed to alleviate serious psychological disorders or unbearable chronic pain, also known as a lobotomy. If you know the history behind that, this is what they used to do in asylums, and they would basically let interns do it. And the way that it worked is they would take an ice pick, and they would put it right here, right in the corner of your eyeball, and then they would shove it straight up, and then they would wiggle it around, and then they would pull it out. And there would just be a little bit of blood, and there's basically nothing to do to recover. Like you're okay, but they're literally taking that metal prod into the frontal cortex of your brain and scrambling it around, and then pulling it out, and then that does a little bit of healing, and then they see how you are. And for some people, there's no difference. So guess what? You get another one, and other people would be more manageable. They would be less violent, less whatever, and some people would be completely, we've heard the term, right, lobotomized. People would be just completely catatonic, drool, no expression, no outward emotions, no verbal communications, no physical movements, just basically walking dead in a chair, because too much got scrambled. So a very imprecise method, but that's what they used to do in asylums to control the more outlandish, out of control patients. It seemed to work to curb aggression. Do they do that today? No, I don't believe they do that today. They probably have much more lasers and technical things that they might do. Do they go in and do brain surgery still and remove pieces or parts of brains? Yeah. So psychosurgery is still a thing, right? But it's just a little more advanced than it used to be. All right, guys. There's the Millennium Falcon, the coolest spaceship in all of spaceship history. Um, that's it. I have now officially done 16 lectures, one for every chapter, and I don't have to do any more video lectures ever, 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 ever again, unless I redo one of these. So, sorry if that's a lot of material and a lot of dry stuff, and hopefully you didn't, stomach all 16 every minute of every lecture. Hopefully you fast forwarded through a bunch of pieces of it, but um, make it for the masses. So you might have skipped the first part of a chapter, but somebody else might have wanted that first part. So sorry if you had to sit through, longer lectures than what you wanted. But again, there's something for everybody. So I wish you well in your future endeavors, and that's it. Y'all have a good rest of your academic career.